It wouldn't stop crying, so I killed it.
You had no right to take my baby away from me!
This court hereby delivers a historic sentence. 500 years in prison. I hope you rot for what you did.
This is the story of 17-year-old Madison Parker, a high school honor student and trusted babysitter who was sentenced to 500 years in prison for what she did to 2-year-old Lily Martinez. It's a story about trust betrayed in the most unthinkable way. About parents who left their child with someone they believed was responsible and came home to a nightmare. About a teenager who seemed perfect on the surface but was hiding something dark and broken underneath. And about a trial that revealed details so disturbing that the judge cleared the courtroom multiple times to protect spectators from the worst of the evidence. Welcome back to Dark Echoes Crime. Before we begin today's case, I need to warn you that what you're about to hear involves the death of a child, and the details are deeply disturbing. This is not entertainment. This is not fiction. This is a real story about real people, and it ended in a tragedy so horrific that the jury members who heard this case required counseling afterward. Some of them still have nightmares years later. The judge who presided over the trial said it was the most difficult case of his 30-year career. And the prosecutor, a woman who'd convicted dozens of murderers, broke down crying when she delivered her closing arguments. But here's what makes this case truly haunting. Madison Parker wasn't some obvious monster. She wasn't a troubled kid with a history of violence. She was the girl next door. The babysitter every parent wanted. She had excellent grades, glowing recommendations, and a resume of happy families who trusted her with their children. She was polite, responsible, mature beyond her years. Parents fought to book her on weekend nights. She was, by all accounts, the perfect babysitter. Until she wasn't. The case that shocked the nation began on a cold Saturday night in November when police received a frantic call from Rafael and Maria Martinez. They just returned home from their anniversary dinner to find their apartment in chaos, their babysitter hysterical, and their 2-year-old daughter missing. What followed was a search that lasted 48 hours and ended in the most unthinkable place imaginable. Little Lily Martinez was found in the chest freezer in the apartment building's storage room, her tiny body frozen solid, her eyes still open. And Madison Parker, the 17-year-old honor student who'd been trusted to keep Lily safe, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. But the story of how Lily ended up in that freezer, and what Madison had done to her in the hours before her death, would prove to be even more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. This is that story. And I promise you, the truth is worse than anything you're imagining right now. The Martinez family seemed to have it all. Rafael was a software engineer at a major tech company. Maria was a nurse at the local children's hospital. They lived in a nice apartment in a good neighborhood. They were devoted parents who doted on their only child, Lily. She was their miracle baby, born after years of fertility struggles and 2 heartbreaking miscarriages. When Lily finally arrived, healthy and perfect, Rafael and Maria felt like their lives were complete. Lily was everything you'd imagine when you think of a perfect toddler. Curly dark hair, big brown eyes, a smile that could light up a room. She was energetic, curious, constantly getting into everything. She loved Sesame Street and her stuffed elephant named Peanut. She was just starting to talk, mixing English and Spanish words in that adorable way that bilingual toddlers do. She called her mother Mommy and her father Poppy, and she'd recently learned to say I love you, which she said constantly to everyone she met. Maria worked night shifts at the hospital 3 times a week, which meant Rafael often needed help with Lily in the evenings. That's how they met Madison Parker. She'd posted a flyer at the local community center advertising her babysitting services. The flyer was professional, typed up neatly with her phone number printed on tear-off strips at the bottom. It listed her experience, her CPR certification, and 3 glowing references from other families. Maria called one of the references, a woman named Susan Chin who'd used Madison regularly for her 2 children. Susan couldn't say enough good things. Madison was punctual, responsible, the kids loved her. She was patient and creative, always coming up with fun activities. She never spent the whole time on her phone like some teenage sitters. She actually engaged with the children, played with them, read to them. Susan said she trusted Madison completely and that she'd left her children with Madison overnight multiple times without any concerns. Based on that recommendation, Maria hired Madison for a trial babysitting session. Just 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon while Maria ran errands. She came home to find Lily happy and content, the apartment tidier than when she'd left, and Madison sitting at the kitchen table helping Lily with a coloring book. It seemed perfect. Over the next 6 months, Madison became the Martinez family's regular babysitter. She watched Lily once or twice a week, usually for a few hours while Raphael and Maria ran errands or went to dinner. Lily seemed to like her. She'd get excited when Madison arrived, running to the door with her little arms outstretched. Madison seemed equally fond of Lily, always bringing little treats or toys, taking pictures of their activities to show Maria later. Maria later told investigators that she never saw any red flags. Madison was always on time, always professional, always left the apartment clean, never asked to be paid more than their agreed rate, never canceled at the last minute. She seemed mature, responsible, exactly what you'd want in someone caring for your child. But there were things Maria didn't know. Things Madison was very careful to hide. Things that, had Maria known them, would have made her never let Madison anywhere near her daughter. Madison Parker grew up in what looked like a normal suburban home. Her father was an accountant. Her mother was a stay-at-home mom. She had an older brother who was away at college. From the outside, they looked like the perfect American family. But inside that house, behind closed doors, things were very different. Madison's father, David Parker, was a functional alcoholic who'd been emotionally abusing his family for years. He was never physically violent, which is why no one outside the family knew what was happening. But he was cruel in other ways. He'd berate Madison's mother for hours over tiny perceived failures. He'd mock Madison for her weight, her appearance, her intelligence. He'd compare her constantly to her older brother, who could do no wrong in his eyes. Madison learned early to be invisible, to be perfect, to never give her father any reason to focus his cruelty on her. She became an overachiever, getting straight A grades, volunteering at church, joining every club that would make her look good. Not because she enjoyed these things but because achievement was armor. If she was perfect, maybe he'd leave her alone. But perfection is exhausting. And underneath Madison's carefully constructed exterior, anger was building. Rage at her father for making her feel worthless. Rage at her mother for never standing up to him. Rage at her brother for being the golden child while she was constantly criticized. Rage at the world for being so unfair. She started babysitting when she was 14, partly for money but mostly for escape. When she was in someone else's house watching someone else's children, she could pretend to be someone different. She could be the responsible, caring person everyone thought she was. She could be in control. And for a few hours she didn't have to go home. Most of the time it was fine. She was genuinely good with children. Patient and creative like Susan Chin had said. But sometimes when a child wouldn't stop crying or wouldn't listen or made a mess, Madison would feel that rage bubbling up. That feeling of being out of control. Of not being perfect. And she'd have to lock herself in the bathroom and breathe deeply until the feeling passed. She never hurt any of the children she babysat. Not in those early years. But she thought about it. When a toddler threw food on the floor she just cleaned, she'd think about how satisfying it would be to slap the child's hand hard enough to really hurt. When a baby wouldn't stop screaming, she'd think about how easy it would be to just cover its mouth until the noise stopped. She never acted on these thoughts. But they were there, dark and persistent, lurking beneath her smile. By the time she was 17, Madison was babysitting regularly for multiple families. She'd built a reputation as the best sitter in the neighborhood. But the rage inside her was getting harder to control. Her father's abuse was escalating. He'd recently discovered that Madison had gotten a B+ on a calculus test, and he'd spent 3 hours berating her for being stupid and lazy, telling her she'd never get into a good college, that she was a disappointment. That night, Madison lay in bed fantasizing about hurting him. Really hurting him. Making him feel as small and worthless as he made her feel. But she couldn't do that. He was her father. He was an adult. He had power over her. So the rage just stayed inside, building and building with nowhere to go. Until the night she was left alone with Lily Martinez. November 14th was Raphael and Maria's 10th wedding anniversary. They'd been planning a special dinner for weeks. Maria had bought a new dress. Raphael had made reservations at the nicest restaurant in town. They were excited to have an evening just the two of them, something they rarely got anymore with Maria's demanding work schedule and the constant demands of parenting a toddler. Madison arrived at 6:30, right on time as always. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She smiled and greeted Lily, who ran to her with her usual enthusiasm. Maria went over the evening routine. Lily had already eaten dinner, but there were snacks in the fridge if she wanted something later. Bedtime was 8 o'clock. Lily needed to brush her teeth first. Her pajamas were laid out on her bed. She usually went down easily but sometimes needed her stuffed elephant and a lullaby. Madison nodded, taking mental notes. She'd heard this routine many times before. Raphael kissed Lily goodbye, telling her to be good for Madison. Maria hesitated at the door, that little flutter of mom guilt that comes from leaving your child even for a few hours. But she pushed it down. Madison was reliable. Lily would be fine. They deserved this night out. The door closed behind them. Madison heard their footsteps fading down the hallway. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of the television playing Lily's favorite show. Madison stood in the entryway for a moment, that familiar feeling of being in control washing over her. This was her domain now. For the next 4 hours she was in charge. Everything was fine for the first 30 minutes. Madison played with Lily, built towers with her blocks, read her a story. Lily was being good, happy and cooperative. But then it was time to start getting ready for bed and Lily didn't want to. She wanted to keep playing. She wanted to watch more TV. When Madison said it was time to go brush teeth, Lily said no. It was a normal toddler response. Any parent knows that getting a 2-year-old to bed is rarely a smooth process. There's always resistance, always negotiations, always one more game or one more story. Maria would have expected this. She would have been patient, would have turned it into a game, would have eventually gotten Lily into bed with minimal fuss. But Madison wasn't a parent. And Madison's patience, already worn thin by years of abuse and suppressed rage, was thinner than usual that night. Her father had yelled at her that morning about college applications. Her mother had just passively watched, saying nothing in Madison's defense. Madison had spent the whole day feeling worthless and angry and trapped. When Lily said no to brushing teeth and ran away laughing, thinking it was a game, something in Madison snapped. Not obviously. Not dramatically. Just a quiet internal shift where the person she pretended to be stepped aside and the person she really was stepped forward. Madison caught Lily easily and carried her to the bathroom. But instead of being gentle and playful, she was rough. She held Lily firmly, too firmly, her fingers digging into the toddler's small arms. Lily started to cry, sensing that something was wrong. Madison told her to shut up. Those words, harsh and cold, made Lily cry harder. And that crying, that piercing toddler wail that grates on the nerves, was the sound that Madison's father's voice had become in her head. It was everything that was out of control. Everything that was imperfect. Everything that needed to be silenced. Madison shook Lily. Not hard at first. Just a little shake, trying to make her stop crying. But Lily only cried more, scared now, calling for her mother. That word, mommy, repeated over and over in a frightened wail, pushed Madison over an edge she didn't even know she was approaching. She shook Lily harder. Hard enough that the toddler's head snapped back. Hard enough that Lily's cries changed from scared to hurt. And instead of stopping, instead of being horrified at what she was doing, Madison felt a surge of satisfaction. She was in control. She could make the noise stop. She had the power. She shook Lily again. And again. Later, the medical examiner would testify that Madison shook Lily with enough force to cause severe brain trauma. The kind of shaking that's called shaken baby syndrome, though Lily wasn't a baby anymore. The kind of shaking that causes blood vessels in the brain to rupture, that makes the brain slam against the inside of the skull, that kills. When Madison finally stopped shaking her, Lily was unconscious. Her little body was limp in Madison's arms. Her eyes were half open but unseeing. A thin line of blood trickled from her nose. And Madison, looking down at what she'd done, felt nothing. No horror. No remorse. Just a distant kind of surprise that it had been so easy. For a long moment, Madison just stood there holding Lily's unconscious body, her mind blank. Then reality started to seep in. Lily wasn't moving. Wasn't breathing. Madison put her on the bathroom floor and checked for a pulse the way she'd been taught in her CPR certification class. Nothing. She tried to do chest compressions but she was shaking now, her hands clumsy and ineffective. She should have called 911. That's what any normal person would have done. Even if it meant admitting what she'd done, even if it meant going to jail, the right thing to do was to call for help. To try to save Lily. But Madison didn't do the right thing. Madison did something so much worse that even hardened detectives were shocked when they pieced together what happened next. Madison picked up Lily's body and carried her to the couch. She arranged her like she was sleeping, positioning her stuffed elephant next to her. Then Madison sat down and turned on the TV. She watched it for almost an hour, occasionally glancing at Lily's body, waiting to see if the little girl would wake up. She didn't. At some point during that hour, Lily Martinez died. Her brain, already severely damaged from the shaking, began to swell. Without medical intervention, the swelling increased pressure until her brainstem could no longer function. Her heart stopped. And Madison Parker, sitting 3 feet away watching a sitcom, did nothing. When it became clear that Lily wasn't going to wake up, when the reality of what Madison had done became undeniable, panic finally set in. But it wasn't the panic of remorse or grief. It was the panic of self-preservation. Madison needed to hide what she'd done. She needed time to figure out a story. She needed Lily's body to disappear. The apartment building where the Martinez family lived had a storage room in the basement where residents could keep extra belongings. Each unit had a locked storage space, but there were also some common areas including a large chest freezer that residents could use for overflow frozen goods. Madison had been to the storage room before, helping Maria carry down boxes. Madison knew there was a freezer. And in her panicked state, her mind fixated on it as a solution. If she could hide Lily's body in the freezer, she'd have time to think. Time to come up with a plan. Time to figure out what to do. It was 9:30 at night. Most of the building's residents were home, but the storage room was in a quiet corner of the basement. Madison wrapped Lily's body in a blanket, making a bundle that from a distance might look like she was just carrying linens or towels. She used the apartment key to access the storage room, her heart pounding, terrified someone would see her. The storage room was empty. The chest freezer was against the far wall, humming quietly. Madison opened it and found it mostly empty, just some frozen vegetables and a few forgotten packages of meat. She placed Lily's body inside, still wrapped in the blanket. The toddler's small form fit easily in the freezer. Madison closed the lid and stood there for a moment, breathing hard, her mind racing. Then she went back upstairs to the apartment and began staging a scene. She opened the front door and left it slightly ajar. She knocked over some furniture. She scattered Lily's toys around the living room. She messed up her own hair and clothes. And then she waited for Raphael and Maria to come home. When they walked in at 11:15, happy and relaxed from their anniversary dinner, they found Madison sitting on the floor of the entryway, crying hysterically. The apartment door was open. The living room was a mess. And Lily was nowhere to be found. Madison's story was that she'd put Lily to bed at 8:30 and then sat down to do homework. Around 9 o'clock, she heard a noise and went to check on Lily. The bedroom was empty. The front door was open. Lily was gone. Madison claimed she'd searched the entire apartment, had run through the hallways calling for Lily, had knocked on neighbors' doors asking if anyone had seen a toddler. When no one had, she'd called Raphael and Maria in a panic. But there were problems with Madison's story. Problems that police noticed immediately when they arrived to investigate. First, if Madison had been searching for Lily since 9 o'clock, why hadn't she called the police? She claimed she wanted to wait for the parents to get home first, but that made no sense. A missing toddler is a call 911 situation immediately. Second, the apartment door had a deadbolt that locked automatically when closed. For the door to be open, someone would have had to deliberately unlock it from the inside. Could 2-year-old Lily have done that? It seemed unlikely. The deadbolt was high up, out of a toddler's reach. Third, neighbors reported they hadn't heard anything unusual. No crying toddler running through the halls. No sounds of searching or Madison calling Lily's name. The building had thin walls. If Madison had really been frantically searching for over an hour, someone would have heard something. But the most damning problem with Madison's story wouldn't become apparent until they found Lily's body. Because the medical examiner would determine that Lily had died between 8 and 9 p.m., based on body temperature and other factors. Which meant Lily was already dead when Madison claimed she'd put her to bed peacefully. Which meant everything Madison said was a lie. The search for Lily Martinez lasted 48 hours and involved over 100 police officers, volunteers, and search dogs. They combed the neighborhood. They checked every apartment in the building. They reviewed security camera footage from nearby businesses. They interviewed every resident, every person who'd been in the area that night. They found nothing. Raphael and Maria were devastated beyond words. They did television interviews, begging anyone who knew anything to come forward. Maria could barely speak through her tears. Raphael held his wife and looked directly into the camera, his voice breaking as he pleaded with whoever had taken his daughter to please bring her back safely. Behind the scenes, police were already suspicious of Madison. Her story had too many holes. Her behavior was off. When detectives interviewed her, she seemed more concerned about getting her story straight than about Lily's welfare. She didn't ask about the search efforts. She didn't express appropriate emotions. She seemed detached, almost clinical, when describing what had happened. Detectives decided to search Madison's belongings. They found her phone and immediately noticed something disturbing. Between 8 and 10 p.m. on the night Lily disappeared, Madison had been conducting internet searches. The searches included phrases like how to hide a body, can police find a body in freezer, how long does frozen body last, and what happens if you shake a baby. These searches were conducted while Madison claimed she was frantically looking for a missing toddler. They were conducted before she called Raphael and Maria. They were conducted during the exact time frame when Lily was dying or had just died. The searches were, in the opinion of every detective who saw them, the searches of someone who had just committed murder and was trying to cover it up. Armed with this information, detectives brought Madison in for another interview. This time they were direct. They knew she'd hurt Lily. They knew she'd hidden the body. They just needed her to tell them where Lily was so the family could have closure. Madison stuck to her story at first. But as the interview went on, as detectives presented the evidence, her facade started to crack. She started crying, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of self-pity. She started talking about how hard her life was, how much pressure she was under, how nobody understood what she dealt with at home. Detectives played on this. They sympathized. They suggested that maybe Lily had been difficult that night. That maybe something had happened accidentally. That they understood Madison hadn't meant to hurt her. They just needed to know where Lily was. And finally, after 6 hours of interrogation, Madison broke. She admitted that Lily had made her angry. That she'd shaken her to make her stop crying. That Lily had stopped breathing and Madison had panicked. And she told them where to find the body. Police went immediately to the storage room. They opened the chest freezer. And there, wrapped in a pink blanket covered with flowers, was the frozen body of Lily Martinez. Her eyes were still open, staring at nothing. Her mouth was slightly open as if she'd been crying when she died. The image was so disturbing that several of the officers at the scene had to step outside to compose themselves. Raphael and Maria were notified that their daughter had been found. The victim advocate who delivered the news later said it was the worst moment of her career. Maria's scream when she was told could be heard throughout the police station. Raphael collapsed. They'd spent 2 days hoping, praying, believing that somehow Lily would be found alive. And now they knew their baby had been dead the whole time, hidden in a freezer just feet below their apartment. Madison Parker was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Because of the internet searches she'd conducted, because of the deliberate steps she'd taken to hide the body, prosecutors argued that this wasn't a tragic accident or a moment of lost control. This was calculated murder. Madison had known what she was doing. She'd had opportunities to save Lily or call for help and had chosen not to. She'd chosen to let a 2-year-old die and then hide her body while pretending to help search for her. The trial began 9 months later. Madison was still 17 but would turn 18 during the proceedings. Her attorneys tried to have her tried as a juvenile, arguing that she was a child herself, that her young age and difficult home life should be taken into consideration. But the prosecution fought hard to have her tried as an adult, and the judge agreed. The nature of the crime, the premeditation shown by the internet searches and the body disposal, and Madison's age at just a few months from legal adulthood, all supported adult prosecution. The trial lasted 3 weeks and was one of the most emotionally difficult proceedings anyone in that courtroom had ever experienced. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the timeline of events, the medical evidence of how Lily died, the internet search history, and Madison's eventual confession. They brought in experts who testified about shaken baby syndrome, about the force required to inflict the kind of injuries Lily sustained, about how those injuries could not have been accidental. They showed the jury photos of Lily's body as it had been found in the freezer. Several jurors cried. One woman had to leave the courtroom. The images were so disturbing that the judge ordered them sealed from public view after the trial. To this day, those photos have never been released to the media, though descriptions of them exist in court transcripts. The prosecution also presented evidence of Madison's state of mind. They brought in a psychologist who testified that Madison showed signs of antisocial personality disorder and lacked normal empathy. They presented journal entries that Madison had written in the weeks before Lily's death. In these entries, Madison wrote about feeling angry all the time, about hating the children she babysat, about fantasizing about hurting them. One entry, written just 3 days before Lily's death, read, "Sometimes I think about what it would be like to just make one of them stop crying permanently." The prosecution argued that Madison hadn't snapped in a moment of anger. She'd been building to this for months. She'd been thinking about hurting children, fantasizing about it. And on that November night, she'd finally acted on those dark impulses. Lily Martinez had simply been unlucky enough to be the child in Madison's care when she finally stopped controlling herself. The defense case was more complicated. They couldn't deny that Madison had killed Lily. Madison had confessed. The evidence was overwhelming. So instead, they tried to explain why it had happened and argue for a lesser charge than first-degree murder. Madison's defense attorney painted a picture of a girl who'd been psychologically abused for years. They brought in Madison's mother, who testified tearfully about her husband's cruelty. They brought in teachers who said Madison always seemed stressed, always trying too hard to be perfect. They brought in a different psychologist who argued that Madison hadn't been born a killer, that she'd been damaged by years of abuse, that she'd never learned healthy coping mechanisms for stress and anger. The defense argued for a verdict of second-degree murder or manslaughter. They admitted that Madison had killed Lily but argued that it hadn't been premeditated. The internet searches they claimed came after the death, not before. Madison had panicked after accidentally shaking Lily too hard and then had made terrible decisions in that panic. She hadn't planned to kill Lily. She'd lost control in a moment of stress. But the prosecution's rebuttal was powerful. They pointed out that Madison had multiple opportunities to save Lily or call for help. Even if the shaking had been unintentional, even if Madison had panicked, she'd then sat and watched TV while a toddler died 3 feet away from her. She'd conducted internet searches about hiding bodies. She'd wrapped Lily's body in a blanket and carried it to a freezer. She'd staged a crime scene. She'd lied to police and to Lily's parents. These were not the actions of someone who'd lost control. These were the actions of someone who'd made deliberate choices. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Maria Martinez took the stand. She was composed at first, answering the prosecution's questions about hiring Madison, about trusting her with Lily, about the night of the murder. But when the prosecutor asked her to describe what Lily was like, Maria broke down completely. She talked about Lily's laugh, about how she loved to dance to music, about how she just learned to blow kisses, about how she'd say "I love you, mommy" every night before bed, about how she'd wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up because she loved animals, about how she'd never get to grow up now, never go to kindergarten, never lose her first tooth, never graduate from high school or college, never fall in love or have children of her own. All of that was gone because Madison Parker had shaken her to death over not wanting to brush her teeth. By the time Maria finished testifying, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom except for Madison's. Madison sat at the defense table looking down at her hands, her expression blank. She didn't cry. She didn't react. She just sat there, and her lack of emotion was more disturbing than tears would have been. The final witness was Madison herself. Against her attorney's advice, she insisted on testifying. She wanted to explain herself. She wanted the jury to understand. But her testimony ended up being one of the most damaging parts of the trial. Madison described her home life, her father's abuse, the pressure she felt to be perfect. She cried as she talked about how hard everything was, how much she'd been suffering. But when the prosecutor asked her about Lily, about those moments when she was shaking a 2-year-old to death, Madison's demeanor changed. She became defensive. She said Lily had been difficult. That Lily wouldn't listen. That Lily had been crying so loud that Madison couldn't think. She said it almost like it was Lily's fault that Madison had killed her. Like the toddler should have been better behaved. The prosecutor pushed her. Asked her about the hour she'd spent sitting and watching TV while Lily died. Asked her about the internet searches. Asked her about putting Lily's body in a freezer. Asked her if she'd thought about Raphael and Maria at all during any of this. Madison's answers were chilling. She said she'd been in shock. That she hadn't been thinking clearly. That she'd panicked and made bad decisions. But she never expressed remorse for Lily. She never said she wished she could take it back. She never said she was sorry. The only thing she seemed sorry about was getting caught. The prosecution's closing argument lasted 2 hours and was described by court observers as one of the most powerful they'd ever heard. The prosecutor, her voice shaking with emotion, walked the jury through every moment of Lily's last hours. She described the fear Lily must have felt when Madison started shaking her. The pain of her brain slamming against her skull. The confusion as she lost consciousness. The quiet terror of dying alone while her killer watched television. She talked about the betrayal of trust. How Raphael and Maria had invited Madison into their home, had trusted her with their most precious possession, and how Madison had repaid that trust by murdering their child. She talked about how Madison had looked them in the eyes and helped them search for Lily, knowing the entire time that Lily was dead in a freezer, knowing that she'd put her there. And then the prosecutor did something unexpected. She pulled up Madison's internet search history on a screen visible to the entire courtroom. She went through each search, reading them out loud. How to hide a body. Can police find a body in freezer? How long does frozen body last? She let them hang in the air, Let the jury really absorb what Madison had been thinking about while Lily was dying. And then she said, these searches weren't made by someone who'd lost control. These searches weren't made by someone in shock or panicking. These searches were made by someone who knew exactly what she'd done and was trying to get away with it. Madison Parker killed Lily Martinez and then she tried to erase her. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is first-degree murder. The defense closing argument was shorter and less effective. Madison's attorney tried to emphasize her youth, her abuse, her lack of criminal history. He argued that she deserved a chance at rehabilitation, that sending a teenager to prison for life accomplished nothing. But his words felt hollow after everything the jury had heard. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of abuse of a corpse. Guilty of obstruction of justice. Guilty of child endangerment resulting in death. Madison showed no reaction when the verdict was read. She just stared straight ahead, her face expressionless. But Maria Martinez collapsed in her husband's arms, sobbing with relief that justice had been done. Before we get to the sentencing that shocked America, I need you to pause for just a moment. If this case has affected you, if you're a parent who's ever trusted a babysitter, if you've ever wondered whether the person caring for your child could hurt them, I want you to do something. Drop a comment below telling us, do you think Madison Parker deserved 500 years? Or was it too much for a 17-year-old? Tell us if you've ever had a bad feeling about a caregiver that you ignored. Tell us if this case changed how you think about childcare. Your stories matter. Your voice matters. And if you want to see more cases like this, cases that expose the hidden dangers we face every day, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what Judge Ramos said next would divide the nation and redefine justice for child killers. Let's continue. Raphael held her and stared at Madison's back, his face a mask of grief and rage. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Under state law, because Lily was under the age of 6, Madison faced an enhanced sentence for the murder. The prosecution asked for the maximum sentence allowed by law. They argued that Madison had shown no remorse, that she'd proven herself to be dangerous, that she should never be allowed to hurt another child. The defense asked for leniency. They argued that Madison was still technically a child herself, just 18 years old at the time of sentencing. They argued that she deserved a chance at redemption. They presented letters from Madison's former teachers and neighbors, all saying she'd been a good kid who'd made a terrible mistake. But then the judge did something unusual. He asked if anyone else wanted to speak at sentencing. And Rafael Martinez stood up. Raphael walked to the front of the courtroom and faced Madison directly. His voice was quiet but steady as he spoke. He said that Madison had taken everything from him and Maria, their daughter, their future, their ability to trust anyone, their sense of safety in the world. He said that Lily had been afraid of Madison in her final moments, that Madison's face had been the last thing Lily saw before she died. He said that Madison had had multiple chances to do the right thing, to call 911, to try to save Lily, to tell the truth. And at every turn, Madison had chosen herself over his daughter, had chosen to hide what she'd done rather than try to help, had chosen to let a toddler die rather than face consequences. And then Raphael said something that silenced the entire courtroom. He said, "My daughter will never get a second chance. She'll never get to grow up, to fall in love, to have children of her own. You took that from her when she was 2 years old. So I'm asking you, Your Honor, to make sure Madison Parker never gets those chances either. Make sure she never gets to leave prison. Make sure she grows old and dies behind bars, knowing that she threw away her life for nothing. That's the only justice there can be for what she did." The judge took a long moment before speaking. When he did, his voice was heavy with emotion. He said that in 30 years on the bench, he'd never seen a case that haunted him like this one. That the image of Lily's body in that freezer would stay with him for the rest of his life. That Madison's complete lack of remorse, even at sentencing, proved she was beyond rehabilitation. And then he handed down a sentence that shocked the courtroom. 500 years in prison. 100 years for first-degree murder. 100 years for abuse of a corpse. 200 years for child endangerment resulting in death. 100 years for obstruction of justice. All to be served consecutively, not concurrently. 500 years meant that Madison Parker, who just turned 18, would never be eligible for parole. She would die in prison. She would never see freedom again. She would spend the next 60, 70, maybe 80 years behind bars, aging and dying in a cell, paying for what she'd done to Lily Martinez. The courtroom erupted. Some people applauded. Others wept. The judge had to bang his gavel multiple times to restore order. Madison's mother collapsed in her seat, sobbing. Madison's attorney immediately announced they would appeal, though legal experts said the chances of overturning the sentence were virtually zero given the brutality of the crime and Madison's lack of remorse. Madison herself remained expressionless as the bailiffs approached to take her back to holding. But as she stood, she turned and looked directly at Maria and Rafael Martinez. It was just a brief glance, maybe 2 seconds, but everyone who witnessed it described it the same way. There was no apology in that look. No remorse. No acknowledgement of the pain she'd caused. Just a cold, empty stare, as if she was looking at strangers who meant nothing to her. That look would haunt Maria for years. The knowledge that the girl who'd murdered her daughter felt nothing. That to Madison, Lily had been nothing more than an inconvenience, a problem to be eliminated and hidden away. That her baby's life had meant so little to the person trusted to protect it. But the story doesn't end with the sentencing. Because in the months after Madison was sent to prison, more disturbing information began to surface. Information that suggested Lily Martinez might not have been Madison's only victim. Information that revealed a pattern of violence that had been building for years, hidden behind Madison's perfect facade. 3 weeks after the sentencing, a woman named Jennifer Torres contacted the police. Jennifer had used Madison as a babysitter 2 years before the Martinez family ever met her. She'd stopped using Madison's services suddenly and had never told anyone why. But after watching the trial coverage, after learning what Madison had done to Lily, Jennifer knew she had to speak up. Jennifer told investigators that Madison had babysat her 3-year-old son Connor on several occasions. Connor had always been a happy, energetic child, but after spending time with Madison, he changed. He became withdrawn and fearful. He started having nightmares. He would cry hysterically whenever Jennifer tried to leave him with any babysitter, even ones he'd previously been comfortable with. When Jennifer asked Connor what was wrong, he was too young to articulate it clearly. He said Madison was mean, that she heard him when he was loud, that she locked him in his closet when he wouldn't stop playing. Connor was only 3 years old and had a vivid imagination, so Jennifer hadn't been sure whether to believe him or if he was making up stories the way young children sometimes do. She'd confronted Madison about Connor's claims. Madison had seemed shocked and deeply hurt by the accusations. She insisted she would never harm a child, that she loved children, that perhaps Connor was acting out because of stress at home. Jennifer's marriage was going through a difficult period at the time, and Madison's explanation made sense. Maybe Connor was reacting to the tension between his parents. But to be safe, Jennifer stopped using Madison's services. She told other parents that Madison was fine but not a great fit for their family, carefully avoiding making accusations she couldn't prove. She moved on and tried to forget about it, convincing herself that she'd overreacted. After the trial, after seeing Madison's complete lack of empathy on display, after hearing the psychologist testify about her long-standing violent fantasies, Jennifer realized Connor had been telling the truth. Madison had hurt him, had locked him in a dark closet, had probably done other things that Connor was too traumatized or too young to fully describe. Police investigated Jennifer's claims. They interviewed Connor, now 5 years old, with a trained child psychologist present. Connor's memories were fragmented, as is typical for traumatic events from early childhood, but he was consistent about certain details. Madison had grabbed him hard enough to leave bruises. She'd shaken him when he was noisy. She'd locked him in his closet and told him that if he cried, she'd make sure he never came out. Investigators pulled Connor's medical records. They found that during the time Madison was babysitting him, Connor had been taken to the pediatrician twice for unexplained bruises. Jennifer had been worried he was being bullied at preschool. The doctor had documented the bruises but hadn't suspected abuse. Looking back with fresh eyes, the pattern and location of the bruises were entirely consistent with being grabbed forcefully by adult hands. Connor had been lucky. Madison had hurt him, had terrorized him, but she hadn't killed him. He'd escaped being her next victim because his mother had listened to her instincts and removed Madison from their lives. But how many other children hadn't been so fortunate? Detectives began the painstaking process of tracking down every family that had ever used Madison's babysitting services. They interviewed dozens of parents and children. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Most families reported no problems whatsoever. Madison had been wonderful with their children. But a small number of families, perhaps 5 or 6 out of the 40 they contacted, reported concerns that they'd previously dismissed or minimized. There was a 4-year-old girl who developed an intense fear of babysitters after spending time with Madison. A 2-year-old boy who'd had unexplained bruises on his upper arms. A 5-year-old who told her parents that Madison said mean things to her but wouldn't elaborate on what those things were. A 3-year-old who started wetting the bed again after being left with Madison. Each incident had seemed minor or explainable at the time. Young children bruise easily from normal play. They develop fears for no apparent reason. They regress in their behavior during stressful periods. Each family had made the quiet decision to stop using Madison's services rather than make accusations they couldn't definitively prove. But taken together, the reports painted a disturbing picture. Madison Parker had been hurting children for years. She'd been gradually escalating her abuse, testing boundaries, seeing what she could get away with. She'd been building toward what she ultimately did to Lily Martinez. The question that haunted investigators was whether Madison had killed before. Lily was the first child who died while in her care, but was she the first child Madison had tried to kill? Had there been other close calls that families didn't know about? Other children who'd been shaken or harmed but had survived without anyone realizing how close they'd come to tragedy? They would probably never know for certain. Young children can't always articulate what happened to them. Parents don't always recognize subtle signs of abuse. And Madison, despite her eventual confession about Lily, refused to discuss any other incidents with investigators. She maintained that Lily was the only child she'd ever seriously hurt, that it had been a one-time loss of control, not a pattern of escalating violence. But the evidence suggested otherwise. And that meant dozens of families who'd trusted Madison with their children were left wondering if their son or daughter had been hurt in ways they'd never known about. Wondering if they'd missed signs. Wondering if their trust had been betrayed even more thoroughly than they'd realized. The psychological toll of the trial extended far beyond Madison and the Martinez family. Several jurors required therapy after the trial ended. They'd been exposed to evidence and testimony that most people never have to confront. They'd seen photographs of a dead toddler. They'd heard medical testimony about the force required to shake a child to death. They'd watched Madison Parker testify without visible remorse about killing a 2-year-old. One juror, a grandmother named Patricia Chin, gave an interview months after the trial. She said she'd been having nightmares ever since. That she'd see Lily's face from the photographs, those empty eyes, and wake up crying in the middle of the night. That she'd started having panic attacks when her own granddaughter cried, overcome with irrational fear that something terrible would happen. Patricia said the hardest part wasn't the gruesome evidence itself, disturbing as it was. The hardest part was watching Madison throughout the trial and seeing absolutely nothing. No grief. No guilt. No humanity. She said it was like watching a robot that had been programmed to look like a teenage girl. All the physical parts were there, but something essential was missing. She said that on the final day when the guilty verdict was read, she'd watched Madison's face carefully, hoping to see some reaction, some sign that Madison understood the gravity of what she'd done. But there was nothing. Madison had looked mildly annoyed, like she'd failed a test she'd expected to pass. She hadn't looked devastated. She hadn't looked remorseful. She'd looked inconvenienced. That image, Patricia said, haunted her more than anything else. Not the photographs of Lily's body. Not the medical testimony about how she died. But Madison's face in that moment, completely devoid of appropriate human emotion. The understanding that some people walk among us who look like us but fundamentally are not like us. Who lack the basic capacity for empathy that makes us human. Judge Harold Ramos, who presided over the trial, spoke about the case years later during a retirement interview. He said the Madison Parker case had been the defining case of his career. That he'd presided over hundreds of criminal trials, had sentenced murderers and rapists and child abusers, but nothing had prepared him for Madison Parker. What disturbed him most, Judge Ramos said, was how utterly normal Madison appeared. How she could have been anyone's daughter, anyone's student, anyone's babysitter. There was no obvious warning sign. No flashing red light that said danger. She'd been hiding in plain sight, hurting children, while everyone around her believed she was wonderful with kids. He said the 500-year sentence had been controversial. Some legal experts criticized it as excessive, arguing that such extreme sentences for juvenile offenders violated principles of proportionate punishment and the understanding that young people have greater capacity for change. But Judge Ramos stood firmly by his decision. He said Madison Parker had proven beyond any doubt that she was irredeemable, that she posed a permanent danger to society, particularly to vulnerable children, and that the only way to ensure she never hurt another child was to guarantee she never left prison. He said he thought about Lily Martinez often. Wondered what she would have become if she'd been allowed to grow up. Wondered how many other children might have become Lily's if Madison had been given a lenient sentence and released while still young. He said the 500-year sentence wasn't just punishment. It was prevention. It was society saying that some actions are so heinous, some people so fundamentally dangerous, that there can be no second chances. The prosecutor, Amanda Chin, left the district attorney's office 2 years after the trial. She'd been one of their best prosecutors with a conviction rate over 90% and a reputation for being tough but fair. But the Madison Parker case had broken something inside her. In her closing argument, she'd mentioned that she was a mother herself, and prosecuting someone for murdering a child while the child's parents sat crying in the courtroom had been almost unbearable. In her exit interview, Amanda said she couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't keep exposing herself to the worst of humanity. Couldn't keep fighting for justice while knowing that for every monster they convicted, there were others out there hurting children right now in this moment, and she was powerless to stop them all. The Madison Parker case, she said, had taught her that evil isn't always obvious. That monsters don't always look like monsters. That the teenage girl with good grades and glowing references could be just as dangerous, perhaps even more so, than the obviously troubled individual everyone was already watching. And that realization had shaken her faith in her own judgment. She found herself unable to look at young people without wondering what darkness they might be hiding beneath their smiles. Amanda became a victims' rights advocate instead, working with families who'd lost children to violence. She said it felt like better use of her skills and training. Less about punishing perpetrators and more about supporting survivors. Less about staring into the abyss and more about helping people find their way back to the light. Rafael and Maria Martinez struggled profoundly in the years following Lily's death. Their marriage, which had been strong and loving before that November night, was tested in ways they never could have imagined. Grief affected them differently, pulling them in opposite directions when they needed each other most. Rafael threw himself into his work, spending 14 and 16-hour days at the office because being home, being in spaces where Lily had played and laughed, was unbearable. The silence in the apartment where a toddler's voice should have been echoed too loudly. Maria, in contrast, couldn't work at all for over a year. How could she go back to being a nurse at a children's hospital, caring for other people's children, when she hadn't been able to protect her own? They tried therapy both individually and as a couple. They joined a support group for parents who'd lost children to violence. They moved out of the apartment where Lily had died, unable to bear living above the basement storage room where their daughter's body had been hidden. But nothing really helped, not at first. The grief was too profound. The trauma too deep. The guilt too overwhelming. Maria would wake up in the middle of the night, forgetting for just a moment that Lily was gone, and reach for the baby monitor that was no longer there. Rafael would come home from work and call out "I'm home" before remembering that the only person who used to run to greet him with squeals of Poppy was gone forever. They'd set the table for dinner and automatically put out 3 plates before realizing, with fresh pain each time, that they only needed 2. They struggled with anger. At Madison, obviously, but also at themselves. Maria blamed herself for leaving Lily that night. She knew intellectually that she couldn't have predicted what would happen, that Madison had seemed completely trustworthy, that any reasonable parent would have made the same decision. But emotionally, she felt like she'd failed at the most basic job of motherhood, which is to keep your child safe. Rafael struggled with his own guilt. He'd been the one who insisted they go out for their anniversary. Maria had been hesitant, had almost suggested they cancel the reservation and stay home. But Rafael had convinced her they needed time together, that Lily would be fine with Madison, that they deserved one evening to celebrate their marriage. If he'd listened to Maria's instincts, if they'd stayed home, Lily would still be alive. These feelings were irrational, their therapist kept telling them. Madison Parker was the only person responsible for what happened. But grief and trauma don't respond to logic. Maria and Rafael couldn't shake the feeling that they'd somehow failed their daughter when she needed them most. Their marriage nearly didn't survive. There were moments when the pain was so great that being together only reminded them of what they'd lost. When looking at each other only brought back memories of that terrible night. When the shared grief felt like too heavy a burden to carry together. They separated briefly, Rafael moving into a hotel for a few weeks while they figured out if they could move forward. But ultimately they came back together. Because as painful as it was to be reminded of Lily, it was even more painful to face that loss alone. Because they were the only 2 people in the world who understood exactly what had been taken from them. Because Lily deserved parents who honored her memory by staying strong. 5 years after Lily's death, Rafael and Maria made a decision that surprised their friends and family. They decided to adopt. Not to replace Lily, no child could ever do that. But because they had so much love to give, and Lily would have wanted them to help other children who needed families. They adopted a 3-year-old girl from foster care named Sophia. She'd been removed from her biological parents due to severe neglect and had spent 2 years moving between foster homes. She was shy, anxious, slow to trust. She had nightmares and attachment issues. She needed parents who understood trauma, who had patience, who could give her the stability she'd never known. Raphael and Maria felt qualified in the saddest possible way. They understood trauma intimately. They knew what it meant to heal from unthinkable loss. And slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild their family. Having Sophia didn't make them miss Lily any less. But it gave them a reason to keep moving forward instead of staying frozen in grief. Sophia's laughter brought life back into their home. Her endless questions forced them to engage with the world again. Her needs meant they couldn't spend all day trapped in painful memories. Maria went back to work part-time at the hospital. Raphael cut back his hours to be more present at home. They made new memories while holding sacred space for the old ones. They talked to Sophia about Lily from the beginning, showing her pictures, making sure she knew about the sister she'd never met but who would always be part of their family. Lily's bedroom became Sophia's bedroom, but Lily's photos stayed on the walls. Her stuffed elephant Peanut sat on a shelf where Sophia could see it but knew not to touch. It was Lily's special toy, and it always would be. They celebrated Lily's birthday every year, going to her favorite park, releasing balloons, remembering their miracle baby who'd been taken too soon. But even as they healed, even as they learned to feel joy again, Raphael and Maria lived with a fear they couldn't entirely shake. Every time they left Sophia with a babysitter, even trusted family members, Maria would feel panic rising in her throat. She installed security cameras throughout the house so she could check in remotely. She called multiple times during even short absences. She came home early from every outing, unable to relax when Sophia was out of her sight. Raphael understood completely. He felt the same barely controlled anxiety. They'd learned the hardest possible lesson that trust can be fatal. That the person who seems perfect might be hiding something monstrous. That you can do everything right, check every reference, trust your instincts, and still lose everything. They attended every single one of Madison Parker's parole hearings, even though they knew she would never be granted parole. Under state law, despite her 500-year sentence, Madison was entitled to parole hearings every few years. It was a legal formality, a constitutional requirement, but Raphael and Maria never missed one. They wanted Madison to see their faces, to be reminded of what she'd taken, to know they would never forget and never forgive. At the first hearing, 3 years into Madison's sentence, Maria read a victim impact statement. Her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face, she described what life had been like without Lily. The kindergarten graduation they'd never attend. The first day of school that would never come. The teenage years, the college applications, the wedding, the grandchildren that would never exist because Madison Parker had ended Lily's life when she was 2 years old over something as meaningless as bedtime resistance. Madison sat through the statement without any visible emotion. When given the opportunity to speak on her own behalf, she said she was sorry for what happened, that she thought about it every day, that she'd been a different person back then, young and troubled, and that prison had changed her, that she'd grown and matured and would never hurt anyone again if given a chance. But her words rang hollow. She'd said similar things at trial, and no one had believed her then either. The parole board denied her request in less than 5 minutes of deliberation. They would deny every subsequent request just as quickly, barely going through the motions of considering her case before stamping it denied. Madison Parker is currently 28 years old. She's been in prison for 10 years and will remain there for the rest of her natural life. She's housed at a maximum security women's correctional facility where she's considered a model inmate by the staff. She follows all rules, causes no behavioral problems, works in the prison library. She's taken college courses online and earned an associate degree in psychology, which some found darkly ironic given her complete lack of empathy. To casual observers or new staff members who don't know her history, Madison might seem like a success story of rehabilitation. She's articulate and polite. She helps other inmates with their legal paperwork. She mentors younger prisoners. She participates in group therapy sessions and says all the right things about taking responsibility and personal growth. But those who truly know her case, who've read her file, who've sat across from her in parole hearings and psychological evaluations, say there's still something fundamentally missing. She can recite the appropriate words, can express what sound like appropriate sentiments, but there's a hollowness to it all. Like she's learned what she's supposed to say and do without actually feeling any of it. Prison psychologists who've evaluated Madison over the years have consistently diagnosed her with antisocial personality disorder. She lacks genuine empathy. She can understand intellectually that what she did was wrong, can recognize that society punishes such actions severely, but she can't feel true remorse the way most people do. To her, Lily's death is an unfortunate event that happened, not something that fills her with genuine guilt and sorrow. In private conversations with other inmates, Madison has been overheard complaining about her sentence. Not expressing guilt about what she did to Lily, but complaining that 500 years was excessive and unfair. That she'd been just 17. That she'd panicked. That everyone makes mistakes. She genuinely seems to view herself as a victim of a harsh justice system rather than as someone who murdered a toddler in cold blood. This fundamental lack of insight, this inability to truly comprehend the gravity of her actions, is precisely why every mental health professional who's evaluated her agrees she should never be released. She's not capable of the kind of genuine change that would make her safe to return to society. She would always pose a risk, particularly to vulnerable children who couldn't protect themselves from her. Madison has limited contact with the outside world. Her mother visits occasionally, though the visits have become less frequent over the years. The conversations are reportedly strained and superficial. Madison's father has never visited even once. He divorced Madison's mother 2 years after the trial and moved to another state, essentially abandoning his entire previous life. He's never publicly acknowledged having a daughter in prison. Madison's older brother, who was away at college when everything happened, completely cut ties with his sister. He legally changed his last name, moved across the country, and refuses to discuss Madison with anyone. He's tried to build a life entirely separate from the Parker family tragedy, though his connection to the case follows him. A simple internet search of his birth name brings up dozens of articles about his sister, the teenage babysitter who murdered a toddler. Madison receives occasional letters from the outside world. Some are from true crime enthusiasts who are fascinated by her case. A few express misguided sympathy, claiming she was too young to deserve such a harsh sentence. Others send hate mail, calling her a monster and describing in graphic detail what they believe should happen to child killers in prison. She reads them all but responds to none of them. Prison officials carefully screen her mail, watching for anything that might indicate manipulation or planning. There have been interview requests over the years from journalists, documentary filmmakers, and even some psychology researchers. Madison has declined all of them. Her attorney has advised her that speaking publicly would serve no purpose and could only harm her in ways that might not be immediately obvious. She has essentially zero chance at parole regardless of what she says or does, so maintaining her privacy is the only control she has left. And so Madison Parker sits in her cell, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, facing the reality that this small space is her life now and will be until the day she dies. She'll grow old in prison. She'll never have a career. Never fall in love or get married. Never have children of her own. Never experience freedom as an adult. Never do any of the things that most people take for granted. Whether that bothers her on any meaningful emotional level is unclear. She's learned not to express her true feelings, learned that showing vulnerability or emotion in prison can be interpreted as weakness. She keeps to herself, does her assigned work, serves her time. And somewhere deep inside, in a place she doesn't examine too closely or discuss with anyone, she still doesn't really understand why everyone made such an enormous deal about what happened to Lily Martinez. The legacy of this case extends far beyond Madison Parker's imprisonment and the Martinez family's ongoing grief. It fundamentally changed the way many people think about childcare and whom they trust with their children. It sparked difficult conversations about background checks, warning signs, and how to identify potential dangers before tragedy strikes. Several states passed legislation in the wake of Lily's death. Known collectively as Lily's Laws, these statutes require anyone who provides childcare for compensation to undergo criminal background checks and register with the state. They mandate that parents receive information about recognizing signs of abuse and knowing what questions to ask potential caregivers. They significantly increase criminal penalties for anyone who harms a child while in a position of trust and care. Critics argue that such laws are somewhat ineffective because Madison Parker had no criminal background whatsoever. She would have passed any background check with flying colors. The warning signs were subtle and easily missed or explained away. But supporters counter that even if the laws prevent just one death, just one child from being hurt, they're worth implementing and enforcing. Child safety organizations have unfortunately used this case as a teaching tool. They've developed comprehensive training materials for parents about thoroughly vetting babysitters, checking references multiple times, trusting instincts when something feels even slightly off about a caregiver. They've created age-appropriate guidelines for children about good touch and bad touch, about speaking up immediately if someone is hurting them or scaring them. Madison Parker's name has become tragically synonymous with betrayed trust in childcare. When news stories cover abuse cases involving babysitters or nannies, they often reference Madison's case as the extreme example that every parent fears. She's become the nightmare that parents think about when they kiss their children goodbye and leave them with someone else. The impact on the babysitting industry was significant and lasting. Many responsible teenage babysitters found that parents were suddenly much more suspicious and cautious. They faced more intrusive questions, more thorough background checks, more unexpected drop-ins to check on things. Some families stopped using teenage babysitters altogether, opting instead for professional nannies from agencies or institutional daycare centers where there's more oversight and supervision. This was deeply frustrating for the vast majority of teenage babysitters who are responsible, caring individuals who genuinely love children and would never dream of harming them. They found themselves paying the social price for Madison Parker's actions, facing suspicion and scrutiny they didn't deserve. But parents couldn't shake the knowledge that Madison Parker had seemed absolutely perfect too. That glowing references and certifications and a friendly smile had meant nothing when the person was fundamentally broken inside. This is Dark Echoes Crime, reminding you that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. That monsters sometimes look like the responsible teenager from down the street. That trust, while necessary, should never be given blindly. Hold your loved ones close. Never take a single moment for granted. And understand that when you trust someone with your child, you're giving them the most precious thing in your entire world. Choose carefully. Pay attention to even small warning signs. Trust your instincts even when you can't fully explain them. Because sometimes the monster isn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. Sometimes it's the babysitter you invited into your home.